The first explosion threw dirt across the shattered road before anyone could reach the wounded man, and the second erased every illusion that there was still time to argue. Radio operators shouted over one another as commanders ordered every soldier to stay exactly where they stood because the ground ahead had become a minefield only seconds earlier. 50 yards beyond the broken armored vehicle, a Navy SEAL lay bleeding into the dust, one leg twisted beneath him, his breathing growing weaker with every passing moment. Every trained instinct told the men surrounding him to run toward their teammate, yet every instinct was chained by the certainty that one careless step would kill them all. Among the frightened faces stood paramedic nurse Emily Carter, her hands already stained with another patient's blood, her dark hair damp beneath a battered combat helmet, her expression unervingly calm despite the thunder of artillery rolling across the valley. She watched the soldiers, staring helplessly toward their fallen brother, and saw something more painful than fear. She saw men being forced to abandon someone they had sworn never to leave behind. The wounded operator tried to lift himself, once before collapsing again. His hand reached toward no one in particular, then dropped into the dirt beside him. The medic beside Emily quietly whispered that he would bleed out long before engineers could safely clear the mines. Nobody answered. There was nothing to say. The silence that followed seemed louder than the explosions. Emily lowered herself onto one knee and studied the scarred earth between her position and the injured SEAL. Fresh tire tracks cut across the road before disappearing beneath torn soil. Small patches of untouched gravel remained where the wind had failed to settle dust. Fragments of broken branches lay scattered in unnatural directions. She was not searching for courage. She was searching for patterns. Years spent treating casualties in conflict zones had taught her that survival often belonged to those who noticed details everyone else ignored. The commanding officer stepped beside her and grabbed her shoulder before she could move. His voice carried the exhaustion of too many impossible decisions. Nobody goes out there. That is an order. Emily looked past him toward the man, fighting to stay conscious. She saw blood spreading beneath his back faster than any tourniquet could stop once his heart finally surrendered. She quietly replied that an order could not change how quickly someone was dying. Before the officer could answer, she slipped free from his grasp and walked toward the edge of the minefield. Every conversation behind her stopped. Every pair of eyes followed her boots. She inhaled slowly, adjusted the trauma pack across her shoulders, and placed her first foot onto the fractured ground. Nothing happened. Another careful step followed. Then another. She never hurried. She examined each inch of earth before allowing her weight to settle. Tiny stones became landmarks. Bent grass became warnings. Even the angle of scattered shell fragments mattered. The soldiers, watching from safety, barely remembered to breathe. Some silently counted each step. Others closed their eyes because watching felt unbearable. A young private whispered a prayer under his breath, not for victory, not for himself, but simply that the woman walking into the minefield would be allowed one more step. The battlefield seemed to shrink until only two people existed within it, Emily and the dying SEAL. The explosions continued somewhere beyond the hills, but they sounded distant now, as though the world itself understood that something more important was unfolding inside that deadly stretch of earth. Halfway across, she stopped beside the shattered remains of a roadside marker. Something caught her attention. A section of disturbed soil looked different from everything around it. She carefully shifted several inches to the left instead of continuing straight. Nobody watching understood why. Later, some would say she had guessed. Others would insist she possessed impossible luck. The truth was simpler. She noticed what everyone else overlooked. The injured SEAL coughed violently, crimson staining the front of his uniform. His breathing became shallow. Emily immediately resumed moving, her pace slightly faster now, without sacrificing precision. Every second mattered. When she finally reached him, his eyes opened only halfway. They struggled to focus on the unfamiliar face kneeling beside him. He tried to speak, but managed only a faint whisper. Emily pressed two fingers gently against his shoulder and told him to save his strength because she intended to get him home. She worked with astonishing speed. A tourniquet tightened above the ruined leg. Compressed gauze sealed the worst bleeding. An airway was cleared. Medication eased the shock, threatening to overwhelm his body. Her hands never trembled despite knowing both their lives depended upon every movement. The SEAL drifted toward unconsciousness again, but before darkness claimed him completely, his fingers weakly gripped the sleeve of her uniform. His lips barely moved. "Leave me," Emily answered without hesitation. "Not today." She secured him inside an emergency rescue harness designed for dragging casualties across rough terrain. It was far from ideal. Every inch back towards safety would demand enormous effort, while avoiding invisible explosives buried beneath loose earth. She checked his pulse one final time, then began pulling him backward exactly along the path she had used to enter. Progress came painfully slowly. Dust coated their faces. Sweat blurred her vision. Her shoulders burned with exhaustion, yet she never allowed frustration to rush her decisions. Behind the defensive line, seasoned soldiers who had survived years of combat stood completely motionless, humbled by the quiet courage unfolding before them. One senior sergeant removed his helmet and held it against his chest without realizing he had done so. Nobody cheered. Nobody shouted encouragement. Respect had silenced them all. Emily had nearly crossed the final stretch when the wounded operator suddenly gasped in agony, his movement pulling unexpectedly against the rescue harness. The shift forced Emily to plant her right boot several inches farther than she intended. A sharp metallic click echoed beneath her foot. She froze instantly. Every heartbeat across the battlefield seemed to stop with her. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound left in the valley was the wind whispering over the silent minefield, while one unseen decision waited beneath her boot. The sound of that single metallic click spread across the battlefield more powerfully than any explosion had all morning. Emily did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply stopped breathing for a moment, allowing every instinct sharpened by years of emergency medicine and conflict zones to settle into perfect focus. The wounded SEAL lay only a few feet behind her, barely conscious, his pulse weakening beneath the pressure bandage she had applied. Around the perimeter of the minefield, rifles remained lowered as dozens of soldiers watched helplessly through binoculars and rifle scopes, unable to intervene without risking even greater catastrophe. The commanding officer pressed a trembling hand against his headset, expecting at any second to hear the detonation that would claim them both. Instead, there was only silence, a strange, heavy silence that seemed to swallow the entire valley. Even the distant artillery had paused. Emily slowly lowered her eyes, without moving her head. The cracked earth beneath her boot revealed nothing except loose gravel and fragments of twisted metal scattered by earlier explosions. She knew that panic made people see danger everywhere, but she also knew that false confidence killed faster than fear. Very carefully, she spoke into the battlefield radio clipped to her vest. Her voice remained remarkably steady. She instructed the soldiers not to move toward her regardless of what happened next. If the ground exploded, they were to remain outside the minefield and continue preparing the evacuation route for the wounded operator. The lieutenant protested immediately, ordering her to stay exactly where she was until engineers arrived. Emily answered with quiet certainty that engineers would arrive too late for the man, whose heartbeat she could already feel fading. Then she fell silent again. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. A breeze carried dust across her boots. She noticed a bent piece of aluminum pressed beneath the sole of her boot, partly buried beneath fresh soil. Its edges had flexed under her weight, creating the sharp clicking sound that had frozen everyone in terror. Still, she refused to assume she was safe. She slowly shifted a fraction of her weight onto her opposite foot, while keeping her body perfectly balanced. Nothing happened. She waited another long moment. The battlefield remained still. Then, inch by inch, she eased her boot backward until the metal fragment slipped harmlessly free. The soldiers watching from the perimeter exhaled together, many realizing only then that they had been holding their breath. Relief washed across the radios, but Emily did not celebrate. She simply tightened her grip on the rescue harness and continued dragging the injured SEAL exactly along the path she had entered. Every movement remained deliberate. Every footprint matched the previous one. When she finally crossed the last few yards and reached solid ground, several medics rushed forward to receive the casualty. Emily collapsed onto one knee beside him only long enough to reassess his injuries. His blood pressure had fallen dangerously low, and shrapnel wounds across his chest continued to seep despite her field dressings. She immediately directed the trauma team with calm precision, ordering blood products, airway support, and rapid transport to the surgical unit waiting several miles away. Only after the helicopter lifted into the sky did she finally allow herself a slow breath. She looked back toward the minefield. 2 narrow trails of disturbed earth marked the impossible journey in and out, silent evidence of a choice that should never have succeeded. The soldiers surrounding her remained unusually quiet. One by one, hardened operators approached simply to nod in respect. None of them could find words equal to what they had witnessed. A young corporal finally broke the silence by asking how she had known where to step. Emily gave the smallest of smiles and replied that she never knew. She only paid attention. Before anyone could ask another question, a convoy of senior military officials arrived from the nearby command center. Their expressions carried less gratitude than curiosity. They requested immediate statements from every witness, mapping each step Emily had taken through the minefield with surprising precision. Engineers later confirmed that multiple live anti-personnel mines had surrounded her route, some less than a foot away from her footprints. The report concluded that survival under those conditions bordered on impossible. Yet that was not what unsettled the investigators most. Several experienced special operations officers reviewed helmet camera footage frame by frame. They noticed the way Emily observed terrain, anticipated hidden hazards, and communicated under pressure. Those behaviors did not resemble civilian humanitarian training. They resembled someone who had once worked alongside elite military units. Hours later, inside the field hospital, surgeons fought desperately to save the wounded SEAL. Emily remained outside the operating room, quietly washing dried blood from her hands in a stainless steel sink. The water ran red before gradually turning clear. She stared at the stream without speaking, as though trying to rinse away memories older than the battle itself. Behind her, 2 Pentagon representatives entered the medical wing, carrying sealed folders. They had not come to congratulate anyone. They had come with questions. One official politely introduced himself before asking where she had learned casualty extraction techniques, normally restricted to advanced combat rescue programs. Emily answered simply that experience had been an unforgiving teacher. The official accepted the response without argument, though his expression revealed it satisfied nothing. As she turned to leave, the corner of her medical identification badge shifted beneath her jacket. For only a second, a small metal insignia hidden behind the badge caught the overhead light. It was old, slightly worn, and almost invisible unless someone knew exactly what they were looking for. The senior Pentagon official froze mid-sentence. His face changed instantly from professional curiosity to stunned recognition. He stepped closer, studying the insignia with widening eyes before whispering a name that none of the nearby staff recognized. Emily quietly covered the insignia with her hand, but it was already too late. The official reached into his folder, pulled out a classified personnel registry, and turned rapidly through several pages until he found a photograph taken many years earlier. He looked from the faded photograph to the woman standing before him, disbelief settling across his face. Without another word, he closed the folder and spoke into his secure radio with a voice far more urgent than before. Within minutes, the message reached the Pentagon, carrying a single sentence that would leave senior defense officials stunned. They had just found the woman they believed had disappeared from military history years ago. The operating room doors remained closed long after midnight, their small windows glowing beneath harsh fluorescent lights, while the quiet rhythm of surgical monitors echoed faintly through the corridor. Emily sat alone at the far end of the waiting area, with a paper cup of untouched coffee cooling between her hands. Her uniform had been replaced with clean hospital scrubs, but dried scratches still crossed her forearms, silent reminders of the minefield that had nearly become her grave. Outside the operating suite, soldiers who had faced enemy fire without hesitation found themselves pacing like anxious family members, each glancing toward the doors every few seconds as though willing them to open. Nobody spoke much. They all understood that the life inside that room balanced on decisions made hours earlier by a woman none of them truly knew. Down the hallway, 2 Pentagon investigators quietly assembled pieces of a history that refused to fit together. Every database search returned fragments instead of answers. Personnel records appeared and disappeared behind layers of classification. Commendations existed without accompanying mission reports. Entire years of service had been sealed so completely that even senior officials lacked authorization to read them. One investigator finally looked across the table and admitted he had never seen a military file constructed like this. The other simply replied that perhaps they were looking at someone who had never been meant to exist in official history. Emily noticed them approaching before they spoke. She recognized the careful expressions worn by people carrying questions that would not disappear. They asked whether she would accompany them to a private conference room once the surgeons finished their work. She nodded without resistance. There was no fear in her eyes, only the quiet fatigue of someone who had spent years expecting this conversation to arrive someday. Inside the small conference room, a recorder rested untouched in the center of the table. No one hurried to switch it on. The senior investigator unfolded a weathered photograph recovered from an archived personnel file. It showed a younger Emily standing beside a military rescue helicopter, her uniform marked with insignia no longer issued, surrounded by faces that had been partially blacked out for security reasons. He slid the photograph across the table. Emily looked at it for several seconds before gently tracing one corner with her finger. She recognized every face, even the ones hidden beneath dark ink. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence settled over the room with surprising weight. Finally, the investigator asked a question that had followed her across years of secrecy. Why had someone with that level of operational experience vanished into civilian humanitarian medicine without accepting promotions, recognition, or public acknowledgement? Emily lowered her eyes. When she finally answered, her voice carried neither bitterness nor pride. She explained that years earlier she had served with a classified combat rescue detachment whose mission was simple in theory and devastating in practice. They entered places where rescue was considered impossible. They recovered the living when they could and refused to leave the fallen behind when they could not. Successes were classified. Failures were buried even deeper. During one operation in a mountainous border region, her team had reached a group of trapped service members after fighting through impossible conditions. They managed to save nearly everyone. Nearly. Her closest friend, another combat medic who had taught her to read disturbed terrain and hidden danger with patient precision, stayed behind to hold an evacuation route open while the others escaped. He never returned, because the mission itself remained classified. There was no public funeral, no headlines, no ceremony that could explain what he had sacrificed. His family received folded flags and carefully edited condolences, but never the truth of his courage. Emily admitted that after that mission, she could no longer separate medals from memories. She resigned quietly and devoted herself to humanitarian medicine, believing the best way to honor those she had lost was simply to keep saving lives without asking anyone to remember her name. The investigators listened without interruption. They realized they were not speaking with someone hiding from recognition, but with someone who had deliberately stepped away from it. Before anyone could continue, a nurse entered the conference room with unexpected news. The SEAL had regained consciousness, though still critically injured. He was asking repeatedly for the paramedic who had rescued him. Emily walked slowly into the intensive care unit, where machines surrounded the recovering operator. His face was pale beneath the oxygen mask, but his eyes focused immediately when she entered. He struggled to raise a hand in greeting. Emily gently steadied it before he exhausted himself. The room remained quiet except for the steady beeping of cardiac monitors. Then, with visible effort, the SEAL whispered that everyone believed she had followed a lucky path through the minefield. Emily smiled faintly but said nothing. He continued anyway. Before the explosion that wounded him, he had crawled several feet after losing consciousness the first time. In doing so, he had unknowingly crossed into an area every later map identified as impossible to traverse safely. From his position on the ground, barely aware of his surroundings, he remembered watching Emily deliberately step away from the safer route and move directly toward him, placing herself inside the most densely mined section, simply because it was the only way to reach his failing heartbeat before it stopped. She had never mentioned that. None of the drone footage captured it clearly. None of the observers outside the minefield could have known. She had quietly accepted everyone believing the rescue had been dangerous enough already. The investigators exchanged stunned glances. The official engineer's reconstruction suddenly appeared incomplete. Emily had knowingly accepted far greater risk than anyone had realized, yet had never corrected the record. The senior Pentagon representative immediately requested every archived file connected to her previous military service. Hours later, a courier arrived carrying a locked case marked with the highest classification available. Inside rested a single sealed recommendation prepared years earlier, but never presented because the mission behind it remained hidden. At the top of the document, beneath layers of faded authorization stamps, appeared Emily Carter's name followed by a recommendation for the nation's highest peacetime honor. Attached to the final page was a handwritten note from the commanding officer who had died before the recommendation could ever be approved. It contained only one sentence: "If history cannot tell her story today, history must someday find the courage to tell it tomorrow." Months passed before the locked files were finally opened inside rooms where classified truths had remained untouched for years. The rescue from the minefield had forced questions that no committee could ignore any longer. Officials who had spent decades protecting operational secrecy now faced a different responsibility. They had to decide whether silence still served justice or whether it had begun to erase the very people it was meant to protect. The wounded SEAL had recovered slowly, enduring surgeries, physical therapy, and countless painful mornings that tested every ounce of his determination. Yet whenever reporters or military leaders asked what had saved his life, he never spoke first about the medicine, the helicopters, or the surgeons. He spoke about the woman who walked into a minefield while everyone else stood frozen, not because they lacked courage, but because she refused to let fear become the final voice in another person's story. His testimony spread through military circles with surprising speed. Men and women who had served in forgotten operations began recognizing pieces of Emily's past that had remained hidden inside their own memories. Retired commanders quietly came forward with records that had long been locked away. Former teammates wrote sworn statements describing missions that history had never acknowledged. Families of fallen operators discovered details about their loved ones that they had waited decades to understand. None of those revelations glorified war. Instead, they revealed something far quieter. They revealed ordinary people making impossible choices because someone else's life depended on them. As the classified barriers slowly lifted, the Pentagon uncovered an uncomfortable truth. Emily Carter had not disappeared from military history because she had failed. She had vanished because her greatest acts of service belonged to missions so sensitive that her name had been removed from public recognition altogether. Promotions had been delayed until they became impossible. Awards had been approved, but never presented. Recommendations had been signed, sealed, and stored where no family, no newspaper, and no history book could ever find them. The Minefield rescue had not created a hero. It had simply exposed one who had been hidden in plain sight for years. When the day of the ceremony finally arrived, it unfolded without unnecessary spectacle. Emily requested that it remain small. She asked that invitations be extended not only to military leaders, but also to the families of those who had never returned from the classified missions that shaped her life. Many entered the hall carrying photographs instead of expectations. Some had never before met the people who had served beside their sons, daughters, husbands, wives, or parents. Quiet conversations filled the room long before any official remarks began. The rescued SEAL walked with a slight limp as he took his place among them. Every step reminded him of the woman whose decision had given him the chance to take another one. When Emily entered the hall, she wore a simple dress beneath a modest service jacket, rather than an elaborate ceremonial uniform. She looked almost uncomfortable standing beneath the lights. She smiled gently at the families instead of the cameras. Those who knew her recognized that expression immediately. It was the same calm face she had carried into the minefield. The Secretary of Defense spoke briefly, acknowledging that some sacrifices remain invisible far longer than they should. He admitted that institutions, despite their best intentions, sometimes allow secrecy to outlive fairness. Then he invited Emily forward. As the long-delayed medal was placed in her hands, the room stood in complete silence. Not the silence of protocol, but the silence reserved for moments too meaningful to interrupt. Emily looked down at the medal for several seconds before lifting her eyes toward the families seated in front of her. She did not begin by thanking the officials surrounding her. Instead, she turned toward the first row where parents and spouses held faded photographs against their hearts. Her voice remained steady, though emotion softened every word. She said the honor belonged first to those whose names could no longer answer when they were called. She explained that courage had never belonged to one person because every rescue depended on someone willing to stay behind, someone willing to trust another, someone willing to believe that another life mattered as much as their own. Then, she paused. The room became perfectly still. Even the cameras seemed to disappear. She spoke one sentence that would later be engraved beneath a memorial dedicated to combat medics across the country. The bravest people are rarely the ones asking to be remembered. Many in the audience lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped away tears they had made no effort to hide. The rescued SEAL stepped forward unexpectedly. He removed the challenge coin that had traveled with him through every deployment since his recovery and placed it gently into Emily's hand. He told the audience that medals recognize moments, but character reveals itself long before anyone is watching. He explained that while everyone else had seen a minefield, Emily had seen a human being whose story deserved another chapter. That difference, he said, could never be measured by ribbons or ceremonies. After the applause faded, Emily spent far longer speaking with the families than with dignitaries. She listened to stories, answered long-delayed questions, and shared memories that brought comfort rather than pain. For many relatives, it was the first time they truly understood how their loved ones had lived instead of simply how they had died. Those conversations became the real ceremony. The medal remained tucked quietly inside its presentation case, while compassion filled the room instead. Within weeks, Emily returned to the same humanitarian medical organization where she had worked before the rescue. She declined television interviews, lucrative book offers, and speaking tours. The emergency department welcomed her back without fanfare. On her first shift, she treated a frightened child with a broken arm, comforted an elderly man waiting alone for test results, and stayed late to help a new nurse through her first difficult trauma case. Few patients recognized the woman whose face had briefly appeared in headlines around the world. Fewer still realized she carried one of the nation's highest honors beneath an ordinary locker shelf. She seemed perfectly content with that. Years later, the rescued SEAL often visited military academies to mentor young service members. Whenever someone asked him what courage looked like, he never described explosions or medals. He described a quiet nurse kneeling beside a stranger in the middle of a minefield, speaking with the calm certainty of someone who believed every life was worth the risk. Those who heard the story carried it with them long after the lecture ended, not because it celebrated danger, but because it honored compassion strong enough to walk through it. And somewhere, on another ordinary shift, Emily Carter answered yet another emergency call with the same steady hands that had once reached through fear toward hope, proving that the greatest heroes rarely change the world all at once. They simply refuse to stop changing one life at a time. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone whose quiet kindness deserves to be remembered, because sometimes the stories that matter most are the ones that nearly disappeared into silence.